All right, guys. So I'm beginning on this slide, hoping that we finished it yesterday in class. But because I'm recording this a couple days earlier in anticipation for the baby, I wanted to at least start with this slide just in case we didn't, so you have a chance to copy it. Just pause the video and copy it. But for today's lecture, I want to assume that we got this far and that we're moving into the next place. And so we talked about China's relationship to their northern nomadic neighbors. We said how that was hands down their historically most important um, interaction with any of them, more important than Japan, more important than Korea, more important than Vietnam. Their pastoral nomadic neighbors had greater impact on their civilization than anyone. And so today I want to take a look at kind of the methods that politically China used to manage their relationships to these pastoral nomadic peoples on their frontier edges. So, what was the solution to managing unfriendly frontier peoples? And the answer to that is quite simply the tribute system. And the tribute system is actually an enormously important part of our course, and I'm pretty sure you're going to find yourself writing about it um, in multiple different essays for now over the next couple like weeks to months. Um, and so before we talk about how it actually worked, I want to talk about how it was supposed to work, right? This system that the Chinese created to manage their relationships with their um, neighbors, right? And the way it was supposed to work is the Chinese sort of invented this system that sort of relied on this understanding that the Chinese people themselves and the Chinese nation was sort of the center of the universe, the most important, um, and the most evolved and the most advanced civilization on the planet. This is very much in line with how Chinese civilization looked at itself. It had existed for 2,000 years by this point. Basically, saw everyone else as less than them, and so they even called themselves the Middle Kingdom, and everyone else was basically barbarians. And so they created a system that sort of reflected this. Now, there wasn't as much sort of built-in racism as you see in certain other civilizations where you looked at other people and said, well, these other people aren't us and they'll always be below us. And actually, the Chinese belief system really did kind of go on this principle that barbarians could become civilized if they just adopted the advanced, evolved Chinese culture. They could be just like us. And so the Tang and the Song dynasty established this political system, this tribute system, to manage relations with these non-Chinese barbarian peoples. And essentially, the Chinese government looked at itself and said, we are a prize. And everyone else around us wants access to the incredibly rich and advanced Chinese markets, right? And they were right, really, right? Like the peoples of the Indian Ocean trade networks and the Silk Road and Japan and Korea and Vietnam and all these other they wanted access to the Chinese markets. They wanted the silk, they wanted the porcelain, they wanted the tea, they wanted the Chinese manufactured goods. And so, the Chinese government said in order for these non-Chinese people to get access to the Chinese markets, they must acknowledge Chinese superiority. They basically must, once a year, the leader of all these peoples must present themselves to the emperor in the capital of Chang'an, the leader of Japan, the leader of Korea, the leader of Vietnam, the leader of any nation that wishes to trade in China must come to Chang'an, get down on one knee, and basically offer a gift of tribute to the emperor and acknowledge Chinese superiority. And in exchange for this basically public declaration of submissiveness or inferiority, non Chinese peoples would get access to trading in China, right? Selling their goods, buying Chinese goods. And a fun fact is, oftentimes, let's say I'm the emperor of a small Indonesian kingdom presenting myself, and I say, okay, I'm going to present this grand, jeweled golden horse statue to the Chinese emperor as gift. And I get down on my knee and I say, I acknowledge the superiority of your nation's people. Here is a gift. And the emperor would then give a gift back to the person presenting tribute that was oftentimes worth more than the tribute that was just given to him. And this was kind of that same idea where, if I give you a better gift than you give me, then that basically tells you that I'm richer and better and stronger than you are. And this system essentially worked for centuries, right? And that was due to the just sheer enormous scale of the Chinese economic system. It was such a prize to be able to trade in China that non-Chinese peoples, would play by this stupid game um, in order to get that prize. And it worked fairly well. This is kind of, it looks like a Lego or a model of this, right? The emperor would be in that pagoda. The emperor didn't speak because he was, too important, too powerful, but there would be somebody next to the emperor that would whisper in his ear and then speak the emperor's words. And that guy in the blue robe standing forward would be, let's say that's a leader of Japan, about to get down on one knee and basically say, I acknowledge Chinese superiority. Here's a good gift. The emperor would say, your acknowledgement is appreciated. Here's a gift in return. And it was done, right? The tribute system would work. But if that's how it was kind of supposed to work in theory, let's look at how historically it actually worked in practice, right? Because we know that how things are supposed to work in theory do not always pan out to how they actually work um, over many hundreds of years in practice. And the reality is that as much as China wanted to see itself as the superior middle kingdom, um, there were times in its history where, especially the nomadic peoples in all their strength, could actually present themselves as equal, if not even superior, to the Chinese emperor and the Chinese nation. Um, this happened when the Xiongnu Confederacy around 200 BCE, so way back before the beginning of the Han Dynasty, or right around the beginning of the Han Dynasty, the Xiongnu people, which were pastoral nomadic steppe peoples, were basically stronger militarily than the Chinese nation. And um, in this case, the Xiongnu actually came to the emperor and said, you know what, we actually are going to force you to acknowledge our equality, right? And the emperor actually did have to acknowledge Xiongnu equality in exchange for them not invading. And essentially, they had to pay the Xiongnu tribute. The same thing happened with some of the Turkic empires, the Turks, that developed on the pastoral steppe regions of Mongolia. The Uyghurs actually came into the Tang dynasty and rescued it. There was internal revolt, threatened to overthrow the Tang dynasty. And the Uyghurs, which were pastoral nomadic peoples in the western part of China, actually came in order to save the Tang dynasty. Now, why would the Uyghurs do that? Why would these pastoral nomadic empires, um, who were really Chinese enemies, why would they also then go into China and pull their butt out of the fire and keep them from collapsing? And the answer to that is peace is good for business, right? The Uyghurs looked at it and said, well, we don't really like you guys, and you treat us like dirt, and you pretend that you're all high and mighty, and you have this middle kingdom idea, but we can see that you're struggling here, and that if we don't come in and rescue you, China's going to collapse. And then what happens? Well, if China collapses, the Silk Road trade dries up. The Indian Ocean trade gets less. And so a lot of these what do you want to say? These pastoral nomadic empires actually looked at it and said, "Well, we don't like you, but we're kind of frenemies, right? Like a strong China is good for business." Um, Generally speaking, these steppe nomadic peoples didn't really want to conquer China. It wasn't a region that was conducive to their way of life. Instead, they preferred extortion. Hey, we won't invade you as long as you pay us bribes not to do it. And then, like I said, sometimes these nomadic peoples would even come in and rescue the Chinese state in order to keep like business arrangements strong, right? A stable China was good for business. Um, We did see several nomadic and steppe peoples take parts of northern China, but again, this is the tribute system in practice. So, in theory, the tribute system was supposed to place China as the center of the universe, and everyone else was inferior and bowed before them. In practice, this happens sometimes, particularly to places like Vietnam and Korea, but the pastoral nomadic peoples especially were oftentimes in a position to ignore it and even flip it in reverse. Here's just a map kind of showing that this is the steppe region of the north where the Uyghurs and the Turks and the Mongol tribes kind of lived. This is all that giant piece of Kansas that kind of continues all the way down. So, what was the solution? This is continuing. We did see in the relationship between the pastoral nomadic peoples and Chinese that nomadic rulers often did adopt some Chinese ways. Um, though Chinese culture in general didn't spread very far into the pastoral nomadic peoples themselves. The leaders sometimes would adopt, you know, some of the rituals and the Confucian ways of doing things, and maybe even a civil service exam or two. But Chinese culture really didn't have a lot of impact on the steppe peoples themselves. Um, Pastoral societies tended to retain their own cultural patterns associated with their, large animal herds and their way of living. Um, Especially since a lot of the Chinese ways of living and Chinese culture is really dependent on Chinese style agriculture, which simply wasn't possible in this drier, colder, harsher steppe climatic region. We did, however, see the opposite happen a lot, that pastoral nomadic culture did influence parts of China pretty substantially. We saw it in the sense that the Sui and the Tang dynasties were both founded by families that had mixed blood of Chinese blood and pastoral nomadic people's blood, right? And that there was oftentimes intermarriage between some of the more important tribes of the steppes and Chinese rich landowning families. And so the founders of both these dynasties had pastoral nomadic blood. And it became almost like the fashion, right? Where during the Tang Dynasty, Chinese elites actually would wear clothing or, basically do things that was like, ooh, that's so hot right now, right? Like the barbarians, anything connected to the pastoral nomadic peoples was always like fashionable and like a fad during the time. Um, Final question I think we're going to have time for today is how did China affect late classical era world economy? Um, we know that Chinese technology really reigned supreme for a lot of world history. Chinese innovations spread far beyond China's borders. We saw it specifically. China pioneered a pretty novel way of salt production. You can see it in that top right picture where they would basically build giant pools near the ocean where they would flood it with ocean water and then seal it up and let the sun evaporate all the water out, and then they'd harvest the sea salt through solar evaporation. We know that the Chinese people originated paper making, which became hugely important for the passage of books and religious texts and things like that in Europe. We know that Chinese peoples invented the printing and movable type. And this spread into Europe where Johannes Gutenberg got it and turned it into the printing press. We know they invented gunpowder, which was originally used for fireworks and rockets. And after it reached Europe, right, the Europeans looked at it and said, these fireworks are nice and all, but we could really use this to kill people a lot faster and more efficiently. And then, plain and simply, Chinese textiles, like some of their cotton processes and silks and metallurgy and naval technologies, the magnetic compass. China really was the driver of global innovation for about 1500 years. The Middle East did a lot too, but really a lot of it came from China. And that the riches available in China basically stimulated not only the Silk Road, but the Indian Ocean trade network and life all over Eurasia. We're likely not going to have time for this one, so I will just kind of put this out for those of you who want to pause and copy this. How did the world economy affect China? And then the last question here that I will continue to do so you can pause it is how did Buddhism and China affect each other? You don't have to copy this for the lecture notes, but here it is. Pause it if you'd like it so you can copy it for the quiz. And then why did China ultimately turn on Buddhism? Right? and here it is. Go ahead and pause and use it. Have a good weekend.